This is part 2, chapters 7 through 20 of the book Project 2025 Quick Review by Marko Vovk, available on Amazon. Reversing climate change policies and focusing on fossil fuels. Project 2025's climate and energy policy marks a dramatic shift from current guidelines which focus on fossil fuel production and the rollback of climate initiatives. The plan calls for slashing federal funding for renewable energy research and replacing carbon reduction goals with efforts to increase energy production and security. The document emphasizes boosting the fossil fuel industry by increasing oil, gas, and coal production, rolling back environmental regulations, potentially withdrawing from international climate agreements, and loosening emission standards for industries and vehicles. Project 2025 proposes restructuring ecological and energy policy agencies, including the potential elimination of the Environmental Protection Agency. A key goal is energy independence through increased domestic fossil fuel production, expanding offshore drilling, and opening federal lands for exploration. While focusing on fossil fuels, the plan also suggests facilitating innovations in the civilian nuclear industry. It proposes redefining agency missions to focus more on energy production and less on climate change mitigation. The document frames these changes as necessary for economic growth and job creation. It suggests promoting alternative views on climate change, potentially challenging the scientific consensus on human-caused global warming. Specific examples include withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, repealing the Clean Power Plan, expanding oil and gas leasing on federal lands, and reducing subsidies for renewable energy projects. The plan also aims to streamline approval processes for new pipelines and revise vehicle fuel efficiency standards. Critics argue these policies would significantly reduce efforts to combat climate change and have long-term environmental consequences. They warn of potential increases in greenhouse gas emissions and the risk of falling behind in clean energy technologies. Additionally, they blame the increase in tornadoes and hurricanes on climate change. Supporters argue that these changes are necessary to ensure energy security, stimulate economic growth, and lower energy costs. They claim current climate policies are overly burdensome and ineffective. Eliminating the Department of Education. Project 2025 proposes eliminating the Department of Education, arguing that education is a responsibility of states and local governments. The plan calls for transferring essential functions to other agencies or eliminating them. It suggests transferring the management of federal student loan programs to the Department of the Treasury, moving education-related civil rights enforcement to the Department of Justice, and transferring educational research and statistics functions to the Department of Health and Human Services, or eliminating them. The plan emphasizes returning control of education policy and funding to state and local governments. It suggests that federal education funding should be reduced or eliminated, with states and localities expected to fill the gap. This would likely eliminate national initiatives such as Common Core standards and federal mandates for standardized testing. The plan's specific examples include ending federal grant programs for K through 12 education, dismantling the Office for Civil Rights within the Department of Education, and eliminating federal regulations on school curricula and teaching methods. Additionally, the plan proposes discontinuing the federal collection of educational data and statistics, as well as ending federal oversight of special education programs mandated by the IDA. To address the complexity of eliminating an entire federal department, the strategy recommends a phased approach that involves immediate executive actions to reduce the department's authority and responsibilities. It also recommends working with Congress to draft and pass legislation to dissolve the department and transfer necessary functions to other agencies over a set period. Potential impacts of the proposal include significant changes in education funding for low-income districts, disparities in educational standards and quality across states, reduce federal oversight of educational equity and civil rights in schools, and changes in how student loans are administered and available. Critics argue that eliminating the Department of Education could increase educational inequality and reduce protections for vulnerable students. They also warn that states may struggle to fill the funding gap left by reduced federal support. Additionally, they question the impact on teachers who are already underpaid. On the other hand, supporters of Project 2025 argue that this move would reduce bureaucracy, increase local control over education, and lead to more innovative and efficient educational systems tailored to local needs. Strengthening border security and immigration enforcement. Project 2025 outlines an aggressive approach to strengthening border security and immigration enforcement. The plan proposes creating a new cabinet-level department dedicated solely to immigration and consolidating existing immigration-related agencies. It calls for completing the border wall construction along the U.S.-Mexico border and expanding the number of Border Patrol agents. The document recommends tightening asylum rules and expanding detention facilities to accommodate a larger number of immigrants during the processing period. Project 2025 focuses on identifying and deporting individuals who have entered the country illegally or overstayed their visas. It proposes withholding federal funding from sanctuary cities and implementing a nationwide mandatory e-verify system. This comprehensive approach will address the root causes of illegal immigration. The plan proposes reducing overall levels of legal immigration and implementing a merit-based system. Specific examples include reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy and expanding expedited removal procedures. The plan emphasizes the use of executive actions and agency rulemaking to implement these changes quickly. Critics argue these proposals would significantly restrict both legal and illegal immigration, potentially leading to human rights concerns. This plan goes too far, a human rights advocate stated. It could tear families apart and create a hostile environment for immigrants. Supporters argue that these measures are necessary to secure the border, enforce existing laws, and safeguard American jobs and national security. The document suggests leveraging federal funding to ensure compliance with new immigration policies. Promoting school choice and voucher programs. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy for promoting school choice and voucher programs. It emphasizes the need to provide parents with more educational options and control over their children's education. The proposal advocates for policies that support school adoption to improve academic outcomes and foster competition among educational institutions. One key objective is to expand voucher programs, allowing parents to use public funding to send their children to private learning centers. This approach aims to provide low-income families with access to higher quality education. The plan argues that voucher programs can help break the cycle of poverty by allowing children to attend educational institutions that better meet their needs. Project 2025 also supports the implementation of education savings accounts, which enable parents to use public funds for various educational expenses, including private school tuition, tutoring, and online courses. ESAs are designed to provide parents with more flexibility in customizing their children's education and ensure that funds are used to benefit the student. The document highlights the significance of charter learning centers as a vital component of the school choice movement. Charter schools are publicly funded but operate outside the traditional public school system, allowing for more innovative and tailored educational approaches. Project 2025 calls for increasing the number of charter institutions and providing them with greater autonomy to experiment with different teaching methods. It also advocates for policies to support homeschooling, recognizing it as a viable alternative for families seeking more control over their children's education. The plan aims to remove regulatory barriers that hinder homeschooling and provide resources and support for homeschooling families. This includes access to public school extracurricular activities and standardized testing. The plan also emphasizes transparency and accountability in all public, private, or charter schools. Project 2025 proposes implementing standardized testing and reporting requirements to ensure all schools meet high academic standards. This transparency helps parents make informed decisions about their children's education and hold schools accountable for their performance. In addition to promoting school choice, the initiative advocates for public school reforms that aim to improve students' educational outcomes. The plan includes increasing funding for teacher training and development, reducing class sizes, and implementing evidence-based teaching practices. The plan also advocates for curriculum reforms that emphasize academic subjects and remove inappropriate biased content. The proposal suggests that school choice and voucher programs can help alleviate educational disparities, enabling all children to achieve success. It emphasizes the need to empower parents and give them more control over their children's education, arguing that this will lead to better educational outcomes and a more equitable education system. Specific examples from the document include proposing federal legislation to expand voucher programs and education savings accounts, providing funding for the expansion of charter schools, and removing regulatory barriers to homeschooling. The blueprint also calls for establishing a federal office to oversee and promote school choice initiatives, ensuring their effective implementation. Critics argue that expanding voucher programs and school choice initiatives could divert funding from traditional public schools, thereby exacerbating educational inequalities. They also raise concerns about the accountability and oversight of private and charter schools, arguing they may not be held to the same standards as public schools. Despite these criticisms, Project 2025 maintains that promoting school choice and voucher programs is essential for improving academic outcomes and providing all children with the opportunity to succeed. The strategy emphasizes the need for swift action to implement these reforms and argues that they are necessary to create a more equitable and effective education system. Reducing federal regulations across various sectors. Project 2025 proposes extensive deregulation across various sectors of the federal government. It calls for a comprehensive review to eliminate or streamline thousands of agency rules. The plan recommends an executive order requiring federal bodies to cut 2 existing regulations for every new one proposed. The document emphasizes the need for stricter cost-benefit analysis of new rules, with a focus on minimizing their economic impact. It targets significant reductions in environmental regulations, particularly those related to climate change mitigation and emission standards. Financial sector deregulation aims to address various provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act, which was implemented in response to the 2008 crisis. Supporters argue that freeing businesses from burdensome regulations will spur economic growth and job creation. Critics believe deregulation of the Affordable Care Act would leave millions without insurance. Project 2025 also calls for reducing regulations on the fossil fuel industry and easing drilling restrictions. Healthcare deregulation involves scaling back specific requirements of the Affordable Care Act. Labor regulations, including overtime pay, workplace safety, and union organizations, face cuts. The plan also targets education regulations, notably higher education, including scaling back Title IX enforcement, and emphasizes reducing regulatory burdens on small businesses across all sectors. Specific examples include eliminating the Clean Power Plan, repealing the Waters of the United States rule, and rolling back vehicle fuel efficiency standards. The plan proposes easing offshore drilling restrictions and suggests reducing the authority of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The plan's implementation strategies combine executive orders, agency rulemaking, and legislative proposals. It suggests creating task forces within agencies to identify regulations for elimination or modification, and emphasizes appointing agency heads who are committed to the deregulatory agenda. Project 2025 aims to reshape federal agencies and policies within the first 180 days of a new conservative administration. While supporters argue it will reduce government interference, critics warn of long-term consequences for public health, safety, and economic stability. Expanding domestic energy production, including oil and gas. Project 2025 outlines an ambitious approach to expanding domestic energy production with a focus on oil and gas. The plan calls for boosting fossil fuel production by opening more federal lands and offshore areas for exploration and drilling. It recommends rolling back environmental regulations restricting fossil fuel production, including emission standards and climate change policies. Project 2025 suggests streamlining the permitting process for energy projects to enhance economic growth and achieve energy independence. The document also calls for cutting federal funding for renewable energy research, redirecting resources towards fossil fuel technologies and supporting innovations in the civilian nuclear industry. Key examples include reopening the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas leasing and expanding offshore drilling. The plan calls for reviving the Keystone XL pipeline project, easing restrictions on fracking on federal lands, revising or eliminating the Clean Power Plan, and reducing subsidies for wind and solar energy projects. The plan proposes streamlining the approval process for new liquefied natural gas export terminals. Implementation strategies involve a combination of executive orders, agency rulemaking, and legislative proposals to enact these changes. The plan emphasizes appointing officials who back its energy agenda to crucial positions in relevant agencies. Critics argue these policies could reduce efforts to combat climate change and lead to long-term environmental consequences. Critics warn of potential increases in greenhouse gas emissions and the risk of falling behind in global clean energy efforts. Furthermore, the Keystone deregulation of Native American land would become problematic. Supporters argue that these measures are crucial for ensuring energy security, promoting economic growth, and lowering consumer energy costs. We need to secure our energy future, said a supporter of the plan. This comprehensive approach will strengthen our economy and reduce dependency on foreign energy sources. However, critics argue that the focus on fossil fuels overlooks the urgent need for a sustainable energy solution. Implementation is likely to face significant legal and political challenges from states committed to combating climate change and environmental groups advocating for cleaner energy policies. Reforming the tax code to reduce corporate and individual rates. Project 2025 proposes an ambitious plan to reform the U.S. tax code, simplifying the system and reducing corporate and individual tax rates. The plan aims to stimulate economic growth, encourage investment, and enhance global competitiveness. It suggests reducing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 18%, considering it the most damaging tax and aiming to make the U.S. more competitive globally. The plan also simplifies the tax code by eliminating various deductions and loopholes, broadening the tax base while allowing for lower rates. It extends and expands upon the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which reduced the corporate rate from 35% to 21%. For individual tax reform, Project 2025 proposes simplifying the income tax system to just two brackets, 15% and 30%. The higher rate would apply to income above the Social Security wage base. It suggests creating a flat tax on wage income beyond the standard deduction by combining income and payroll taxes. The plan imposes a 15% tax rate on capital gains and dividends, which is lower than the current rates. It retains and expands tax-preferred savings accounts such as 401ks and IRAs to incentivize saving. Implementation strategies include recommending a 3/5 vote threshold for future legislation to increase individual or corporate income tax rates. The plan suggests phasing in changes to allow individuals and businesses time to adjust. It also proposes eliminating or reducing various tax expenditures to simplify the code and offset revenue losses from rate reductions. Project 2025 criticizes the Federal Reserve and proposes reforms that focus on inflation targeting rather than achieving full employment. Project 2025 argues these reforms would increase economic growth and job creation due to lower tax burdens on businesses and individuals. It claims simplified tax compliance could save taxpayers billions. The plan aims to enhance global competitiveness for U.S. businesses and increase incentives for work, saving, and investment. However, critics and some economic analyses point out potential drawbacks. The Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office estimate that extending the 2017 tax cuts alone would increase the deficit by $4 trillion by 2028. Critics also note that while the 2017 tax cuts spurred some investment, they contributed to an increase in the national debt. They argue that the proposed reforms may disproportionately benefit high-income earners and large corporations. Additionally, the top 1% of millionaires may not be required to pay taxes. Some legal experts question the constitutionality of requiring a supermajority vote for future tax increases. We need to simplify the tax code and reduce rates. As a supporter of Project 2025. Critics warn these changes could lead to increased deficits and benefit the wealthy. Implementing these reforms would likely face significant legal and political difficulties. Prioritizing religious liberty protections. Project 2025 prioritizes religious liberty protections as part of its conservative agenda. The plan aims to instill Christian values in government and society with a focus on safeguarding religious expression in public life. It advocates for a broader interpretation of First Amendment religious freedom protections. The project proposes changes to education policy that could potentially enhance protection for religious expression in schools. It may support religious schools through voucher programs. In healthcare, the plan could expand conscience protections for healthcare providers who object to procedures on the grounds of their religion. Part of their religious project 2025 may strengthen protections for the hiring practices of religious organizations and the workplace faith expression of individuals. It could direct federal agencies to prioritize religious liberty in policies and enforcement actions. The plan may recommend appointing judges and officials likely to support broader religious liberty protections. The policy might emphasize religious freedom, particularly for persecuted minorities worldwide. Given its conservative stance, Project 2025 may propose measures protecting religious objections to LGBTQ+ rights in marriage, adoption, and non-discrimination laws. It could advocate for stronger protections for businesses that refuse service based on religious beliefs. Critics characterize Project 2025 as a plan to transform the U.S. into a Christian nationalist state. They argue that some proposed protections could infringe on the rights of non-religious individuals or those of different faiths. Additionally, it disregards the separation of church and state. Implementation would likely encounter legal and political challenges, particularly where religious protections intersect with civil rights. Restructuring federal healthcare programs. Project 2025 proposes significant changes to federal health care programs, particularly Medicare and Medicaid. The plan aims to shift Medicare towards privatization by making Medicare Advantage the default option for enrollment. This change could impact access to care and costs for millions of seniors. Project 2025 suggests converting federal funding to block grants or per capita caps for Medicaid. This restructuring would limit federal spending and reduce coverage. The plan also proposes altering Medicaid matching rates and imposing work requirements and time limits on beneficiaries. Project 2025 advocates for allowing Medicaid recipients to convert their coverage into vouchers for private insurance. This shift could result in less comprehensive coverage compared to current Medicaid benefits. The plan also aims to reduce federal oversight of Medicaid, thereby giving states greater control. These proposals align with Project 2025's broader goals of reducing federal involvement and promoting market-based solutions in healthcare. Critics argue these changes could lead to coverage losses and increased costs for vulnerable populations. The plan emphasizes market-based approaches to social services, which could lead to increased competition and reduced regulation in the healthcare sector. Project 2025 calls for scaling back various federal programs, including healthcare services. This suggests potential reductions in the scope and funding of programs like Medicare and Medicaid. The overall goal of reducing federal spending could lead to budget cuts for healthcare programs. The plan also calls for reducing federal regulations across various sectors, including those related to healthcare. Project 2025 proposes significant changes to federal agencies, which could affect agencies involved in healthcare, such as the Department of Health and Human Services. Given the project's conservative nature, there may be a shift toward emphasizing individual responsibility in healthcare decisions and financing. While not explicitly mentioned in the search results, Project 2025 may include proposals to modify or repeal aspects of the Affordable Care Act. The full extent of healthcare program restructuring under Project 2025 remains unclear, as does the likelihood of these proposals being enacted. Implementing these changes would likely face significant legal and political issues, particularly in areas that conflict with other civil rights protections. Reforming federal welfare programs. Project 2025 proposes sweeping reforms to federal welfare programs, aligning with conservative principles of limited government and personal responsibility. The plan calls for scaling back social services and shifting responsibility to states and private organizations. We need to empower families, not bureaucrats, declared Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. Our welfare system should be a hand up, not a handout. The project advocates for stricter work requirements and time limits on benefits. It suggests converting some federal welfare programs into block grants, giving states more control over fund allocation. Budget cuts loom as part of the overall goal to reduce federal spending. Project 2025 emphasizes family values in its approach to welfare reform. This could influence policies aimed at promoting traditional family structures. The plan may tighten eligibility requirements for various programs, potentially reducing the number of recipients. Our goal is to break the cycle of dependency, a Project 2025 contributor explained. We want to create pathways to self-sufficiency, not perpetuate reliance on government assistance. The initiative encourages more significant involvement of religious and community organizations in social services. This aligns with the conservative view that local entities are better equipped to address social needs than federal agencies. Critics argue these reforms could leave vulnerable populations without adequate support. Additionally, they believe that family values have nothing to do with poor life choices, and many single-parent families tax the welfare system. Proponents counter that streamlining welfare programs will ultimately benefit both recipients and taxpayers. While specific details remain limited, Project 2025's approach to welfare reform reflects a broader vision of reducing the federal government's role in social services. The full impact of these proposed changes on America's social safety net remains to be seen. Expanding Second Amendment rights. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy to expand Second Amendment rights, emphasizing their importance as fundamental constitutional protections. The plan advocates for policies that reinforce and broaden these rights across the United States. It proposes federal legislation to ensure uniform protection, preempting stricter state gun control measures. A key focus is appointing federal judges and Supreme Court justices with records that support Second Amendment rights. This aims to ensure the judiciary interprets the Constitution in favor of expansive gun rights. The plan calls for eliminating gun-free zones in schools and public places, arguing these areas make law-abiding citizens vulnerable. Project 2025 advocates for national reciprocity for concealed carry permits, allowing individuals to carry firearms across state lines legally. It also seeks to reduce bureaucratic barriers to gun ownership, proposing a streamlined process for purchasing and carrying firearms. Specific proposals include repealing the National Firearms Act, which regulates certain firearms, such as machine guns and silencers. The plan argues that these regulations are outdated and infringe on Second Amendment rights. It also suggests abolishing the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and transferring its functions to other agencies. The document includes expanding access to public lands for hunting and recreational shooting, as well as promoting responsible firearm use. It advocates for educational programs that teach gun safety to both adults and children. Implementation strategies involve executive orders rolling back restrictive measures from previous administrations. Project 2025 calls for working with Congress to pass comprehensive gun rights legislation and repeal existing gun control laws. It emphasizes public advocacy and grassroots movements to influence opinion and policy. These measures could lead to increased gun ownership and public carrying of firearms. However, they may face legal challenges from states with stricter laws. Critics argue that reducing gun control could increase violence, while supporters contend it would enhance safety and deter crime. Additionally, nothing is said about background checks or the denial of ownership of people's failing mental health. Project 2025's proposals reflect a commitment to enhancing gun ownership rights in the United States. The plan outlines a multifaceted approach, including legislative, judicial, and executive actions to reduce firearm restrictions and promote responsible ownership. Reshaping foreign policy, potentially with an America First approach. Project 2025 outlines a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, emphasizing an America First approach, prioritizing national interests over global commitments. The plan proposes a narrower definition of U.S. national interests, focusing on direct threats to American security and economic well-being. This approach could lead to reduced overseas commitments and interventions. The document proposes a comprehensive review of existing international agreements and treaties. This review may result in the withdrawal from or renegotiation of the accords that are unfavorable to U.S. interests. Project 2025 suggests overhauling U.S. foreign aid programs, tying aid to American strategic interests. The plan advocates for a more protectionist trade policy, emphasizing bilateral agreements over multilateral ones. It calls for renegotiating trade deals to prioritize American jobs and industries. Project 2025 proposes a shift in military strategy, focusing on direct threats to U.S. territory rather than maintaining a global presence. The document suggests a skeptical approach to international organizations such as the United Nations and NATO. This could involve reducing U.S. financial contributions and questioning the authority of these organizations. Project 2025 emphasizes stricter immigration policies and enhanced border security as critical components of foreign policy. The plan proposes policies to achieve energy independence, influencing decisions related to oil-producing nations and global energy markets. It emphasizes cybersecurity and technological superiority as crucial elements of foreign policy. Project 2025 proposes a pragmatic approach to human rights and democracy promotion, prioritizing these issues when they align with U.S. strategic interests. Potential policy changes include withdrawing from international climate agreements, renegotiating trade agreements, reducing UN contributions, and implementing stricter visa policies. This approach represents a significant departure from traditional U.S. foreign policy, emphasizing a more unilateral and interest-driven approach to international relations. Reforming election laws and voting procedures. Project 2025 outlines a comprehensive strategy for reforming election laws and voting procedures to ensure election integrity and reduce perceived vulnerabilities. The plan advocates for strict voter ID laws, requiring all voters to present government-issued identification at the polls. This measure aims to prevent voter fraud and ensure that only eligible voters participate in the election process. Project 2025 advocates for eliminating or reducing mail-in voting, citing concerns that it may be prone to fraud and abuse. The plan emphasizes in-person voting as the primary method for casting ballots. It proposes limiting early voting periods to reduce irregularities and ensure all voters have access to the same information before voting. The document emphasizes the importance of regular voter roll maintenance to remove ineligible voters, such as those who have moved, passed away, or are no longer eligible to vote for other reasons. Project 2025 includes provisions to enhance poll watchers' rights, allowing them greater access to observe the voting and counting processes to ensure transparency and accountability. The plan calls for banning ballot harvesting, which involves collecting and submitting absentee or mail-in ballots by third parties to prevent potential voter manipulation or coercion. Project 2025 advocates using paper ballots in all elections to create a verifiable paper trail that can be audited and recounted if necessary. The blueprint emphasizes securing election infrastructure against cyber threats, including protecting voter registration databases, voting machines, and other critical systems from hacking and interference.